All right, so I had a question this past week from Beverly, and she mentioned, let me grab a piece of fabric really quick. She mentioned she was struggling with her sewing machine when she was finishing up a bag. If your bag has a flap at the top or some form of bag where you need to sew the top edge of the bag, the exterior and the lining right sides together, those layers can kind of get on the thick side when you're adding all of the fabric and interfacing together. And she mentioned she was getting a bit of her sewing machine slipping off the edge of the fabric and perhaps not catching both the lining and the exterior fabrics and leaving an occasional gap or a hole. And so I wanted to show you, I've heard of people using this method in the past, but I've not tried it myself before today. But this method is for using staples to hold the layers of your fabric before you get them under the sewing machine. So I'm going to jump over to the side camera and show you my little prepared sample and how I use staples for this. Okay, so before the show I prepared an exterior bag. So this is a bag on the simple side. So I've got my exterior fabric attached to foam interfacing, and I sewed the sides and the bottom, and I did the same thing for my lining fabric. The lining's attached to Shape Flex interfacing. So I turned my exterior fabric right side facing out, and I'm going to go ahead and slip it inside my lining so that the fabrics are right sides together. So in the past, I've used Wonder Clips for this particular aspect of bag making, basically finishing the bag up. So what you can do is either add tons of Wonder Clips and hope that they kind of hold in place while your sewing machine is getting through sewing the top area of the bag right sides together. I found that worked for me pretty well in the past, but I also, like Beverly, have noticed I've gotten some slippage of my own. This method will also work for if you're sewing your exterior side panel to the front and back of your bag. You can do the same thing with the staples here. So if you're finding the Wonder Clips are not holding fast for you and kind of slipping in place, you can use some staples. So I put a few on the back side over here before the show, and I'm going to actually staple some live on camera. So for sewing my bag together along the top edge of the bag, I'm going to be using 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you want to make sure that your staples fall within the seam allowance. I've marked it here just for the demonstration portion of this show, but you can mark it on your fabric as well if you feel more comfortable. So this is that 1/2 inch seam allowance, which means I will be sewing on top of the line because that's the 1/2 inch. So you want to keep your staples a little bit above the halfway point because we want to keep it away from the needle. Certainly you don't want to be sewing over any staples. But I'm just going to go ahead and this is just a regular stapler, and you can staple the staples as close as you feel that you need them. So if you want to staple them every 1/2 inch or whatever you feel comfortable with is totally fine. And this helps a little bit better than Wonder Clips because the staples obviously are not going to shift. Okay, so I'm going to flip this over. You can see the staples right there. I prepared this little portion before the show. As you can see, I've got the staples over here. I've got my stitches right over here on the line. And so in theory, you'll be sewing around the entire outer edge of the bag. I don't have my sewing machine up on the counter for the live shows, but after you've stitched all the way around the bag, you're just going to cut the seam allowance approximately in half. So in theory, you'll be removing those zippers. So it's a good habit to, if you're using a 1/2 inch seam for finishing up your bag, to trim the seam allowance in half to about 1/4 inch anyway. So when you're trimming those seam allowances in half, you'll be removing those staples. So the staples will not be left in the finished bag. And then you'll have a nice finished top edge of the bag without any gaps because the staples held everything in place. So hopefully that makes sense. Obviously this is a very simplistic bag. I didn't want to go ahead and sew an entire Polaris bag or anything like that, but I think you get the idea with the staples. And again, they're easily removable. You don't even have to remove them with a staple remover like I just showed. You just cut them out by trimming the seam allowance in half, and as long as you have place the staples so that you can do that, so not too close to the seam allowance, then it'll be really quick and easy. And this is great for other areas of the bags like I mentioned. For example, when you're sewing your side panel, especially if it's a curved side panel to the front and back of your bag, sometimes that curved area, even with the Wonder Clips, tends to kind of slip away from you, or the fabrics kind of are not aligned as they should be. So the staples would definitely help with that. So thank you so much to Beverly for asking that question. So